The day I almost threw her resume in the trash was the day she changed the way I saw the world. Before we begin, the comments how old you are, where you're from, and whether you're currently in a relationship or secretly thinking about someone. You never know. Your story might help someone else feel a little less alone. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, subscribing to the channel is the best way to support more of them. My name is Victoria Sterling, and for most of my adult life, I believed first impressions were everything. As CEO of Sterling Renewables, I made decisions worth millions of dollars every week. I evaluated business proposals in minutes. I hired executives after a single conversation. In my world, details mattered. Presentation mattered. Discipline mattered. That's why, on a cold Thursday morning in Seattle, I nearly dismissed the most extraordinary woman I would ever meet. Rain had been pounding the city since before sunrise. Sheets of water rolled down the glass walls of our headquarters overlooking Elliott Bay. The forecast had warned of flooding, traffic delays, and strong winds, but none of that changed my schedule. By 8 a.m., I was already in a board meeting reviewing quarterly projections. By 9:30, I was preparing for interviews for a newly created environmental strategy position. Hundreds of candidates had applied. 5 had made the final round. Every one of them had impressive credentials. Every one of them looked perfect on paper. At exactly 9:57, I stepped out of the conference room and walked toward the executive interview suite. My assistant, Lauren, was waiting outside with her tablet. 4 candidates have arrived, she said. The 5th is running late. I glanced at my watch. How late? About 15 minutes. I sighed. Not a great start. Lauren nodded. There's more. Before she could continue, the lobby doors slid open. A gust of wind swept inside. Several people turned. Conversations stopped. Even from 50 feet away, I could see the woman standing in the entrance. Her dark green jacket was soaked. Mud splattered her jeans from ankle to knee. Her boots looked like she'd walked through a construction site. Damp strands of blonde hair clung to her face. Water dripped onto the polished marble floor beneath her. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, I heard a quiet laugh from somewhere near reception. Someone else shook their head. The woman ignored all of it. She stood there catching her breath, one hand gripping a worn leather portfolio. There was something strangely steady about her expression, not embarrassed, not apologetic, just determined. Lauren looked down at her tablet. That's Emily Carter. I stared across the lobby. The candidate? Yes. I felt disbelief settle in my chest. This was the woman interviewing for one of the most competitive positions in the company. She looked as if she'd just climbed out of a muddy hiking trail. Employees were staring. Visitors were whispering. The interview panel would take one look at her and make up their minds before she sat down. And, honestly, so did I. I remember thinking one simple thing as I watched her walk toward the elevators. She doesn't have a chance. I had no idea how wrong I was. Emily disappeared into the restroom reserved for visitors, while the rest of us gathered in the interview suite on the 32nd floor. Through the glass walls, Seattle looked gray and restless beneath the storm clouds. Around the table sat 4 department directors, each holding copies of the candidates' resumes. I took my seat at the head of the table and opened Emily Carter's file. On paper, she was impressive. Graduate degree in environmental engineering, 8 years of field experience, strong recommendations, several successful sustainability projects in rural communities. None of that matched the image currently stuck in my mind of a woman standing in our lobby covered in rain and mud. One of the directors leaned back in his chair. Are we really interviewing her? Another shrugged. Maybe she should come back another day. Nobody said it directly, but I knew what they were thinking. Professionalism mattered. Preparation mattered. Showing up like that suggested poor judgment. At exactly 10:18, the conference room door opened. The conversation stopped immediately. Emily stepped inside carrying the same worn leather portfolio. Her hair was still damp, though she had clearly done her best to clean up. The mud stains remained on her jeans despite her efforts. She looked around the room, fully aware of every curious glance directed her way. What surprised me was that she did not seem intimidated. Nervous, yes. Embarrassed, probably. But not defeated. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was calm. "Thank you for waiting." One of the directors glanced toward me. I decided to begin. "Mrs. Carter, before we start, I think everyone is wondering the same thing." She nodded slightly. "I figured they might be. Why are you here looking like this?" The question sounded harsher than I intended, but I did not take it back. For a brief second, silence filled the room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Emily met my eyes directly. "Because I promised myself I would be here." It was not the answer I expected. I folded my hands on the table. Most people would have rescheduled. Most people probably had better luck this morning. A few faint smiles appeared around the room, she continued. The highway was flooded near Everett. Traffic stopped completely. I left my car and started walking. Then a construction detour forced everyone onto a temporary access road. That is where I slipped. She glanced down at her clothes before looking back up. At that point, I had two options. Go home and explain why I missed the biggest interview of my career, or keep moving. One of the directors frowned. "You walked all the way here?" "Not the entire distance," she said. "A city bus driver took pity on me about 3 miles out." A quiet laugh moved through the room. Even I felt the tension ease slightly. Then I asked the question that changed everything. Why not return home, change clothes, and come back? Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out at the rain beyond the windows. When she finally spoke, her voice softened. Because opportunities do not always wait for perfect conditions. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. "My father worked outdoors his entire life," she continued. "When I was young, he used to tell me that storms do not care about your plans. You either adapt or you stay where you are." She paused. "I spent years working on environmental projects in places where conditions were never ideal. If I quit every time things got messy, I would not have accomplished much." Something shifted in the room. I felt it happen. The directors who had dismissed her 10 minutes earlier were listening differently now. So was I. Emily sat a little straighter. "I am not asking anyone to ignore how I look today. Honestly, I wish I looked a lot better." That earned another round of smiles. But if this company is hiring someone to solve difficult problems, then maybe the worst thing I could have done was give up at the first obstacle. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that appears when people are forced to reconsider an opinion they formed too quickly. I looked down at her resumes once more. Then back at the woman sitting across from me. For the first time that morning, I stopped seeing the mud. I started seeing the person the interview should have ended there. In most cases, a strong answer and a compelling story were enough to leave a positive impression. But Sterling Renewables was not most companies. We solved complex problems worth millions of dollars. Good intentions were not enough. Experience alone was not enough. We needed people who could think under pressure. I glanced toward the directors seated around the table. They were clearly more interested in Emily now than they had been 20 minutes earlier. So was I. Still, curiosity and competence were two different things. I opened a folder that had been sitting beside me since morning. Inside was a summary of a problem our company had been struggling with for nearly 6 months. It involved a renewable water treatment initiative in Eastern Washington. Costs were increasing. Efficiency targets were being missed. 3 consulting firms had already submitted recommendations, and none of them had produced results we were confident implementing. I slid the folder across the table toward Emily. "This is not part of the scheduled interview," I said, "but I would like your opinion." She looked surprised. "Right now?" "Right now." One director shifted in his chair. Another leaned forward with interest. Emily opened the folder. The room became quiet except for the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. I watched her eyes move across charts, maps, and performance reports. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Unlike many candidates, she did not rush to impress anyone. She took notes. She studied the data carefully. Occasionally, she frowned at a chart and flipped back several pages. Finally, she closed the folder. "Can I ask a question?" "Of course," I replied. "Why are all the reports focused on increasing processing capacity?" One of the directors answered immediately. "Because demand is increasing." Emily nodded. "I understand that, but capacity is not the primary problem." The room fell silent again. "Explain." She turned one of the charts around so everyone could see it. "The system performs well during normal conditions. The losses happen during seasonal fluctuations." She pointed toward a section of data most of us had barely noticed. Every consultant tried solving the wrong problem. They assumed the system needed to be bigger. The data suggests it needs to be more flexible. I felt myself sit a little straighter. Emily continued. "You are spending millions preparing for peak demand periods that only happen a small percentage of the year. Instead of expanding infrastructure, I would redesign the operational model." One director crossed his arms. "That sounds simple." "Sometimes simple is better," she replied calmly. There was no arrogance in her voice, no need to prove herself, only confidence. She spent the next 15 minutes outlining an approach none of us had considered. As she spoke, questions came from every direction. Financial projections, environmental impact, staffing requirements, regulatory concerns, Emily answered, each one thoughtfully. Not perfectly. Not like someone pretending to know everything. Like someone genuinely trying to solve a problem. The longer she spoke, the more the atmosphere in the room changed. By the end, nobody was looking at the stains on her jeans anymore. They were looking at her ideas. When she finally finished, silence settled over the conference room. One of the directors glanced at me. Another slowly closed his notebook. I looked at Emily across the table. For the first time all morning, I forgot she was a candidate. She felt like a colleague. "Thank you," I said. Emily smiled politely. "Thank you for the opportunity." The interview concluded a few minutes later. She gathered her portfolio and stood. As she reached the door, she paused. "For what it is worth," she said, looking back at me, "I really admire what this company is trying to accomplish." Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Lauren looked around the room. "Well?" One director laughed quietly. "I think she just solved a problem we have been paying people to solve for months." Another nodded. "Agreed." I remained silent. Through the glass wall, I watched Emily walk across the lobby below. The rain had not stopped. Gray clouds still hung over Seattle. Yet somehow everything looked different than it had an hour earlier. That morning I had seen a woman covered in mud and assumed I understood exactly who she was. Now I realized I had barely begun to understand her at all. 3 days later, Emily Carter walked back into Sterling Renewables, wearing a navy blazer, clean boots, and a calm expression that revealed nothing about how much her life was about to change. The board had approved my recommendation unanimously. That alone was unusual. In 20 years of leadership, I had rarely seen a candidate create such a dramatic shift in opinion during a single interview, most people impressed others with credentials. Emily had done it with clarity, resilience, and an ability to see solutions where everyone else saw obstacles. Lauren escorted her to my office just after 9 in the morning. Through the glass wall, I watched her pause briefly outside the door before stepping inside. Sunlight streamed across the Seattle skyline behind her. The storm that had defined our first meeting was gone. "Good morning," she said, with a small smile. "Good morning, Emily." I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "Please sit." She sat carefully, hands folded in her lap. For the first time, I noticed something I had missed during the interview. Beneath her confidence was a quiet humility. She was not someone who expected opportunities to be handed to her. She was someone accustomed to earning them. I slid a folder across the desk. "This contains the details of your 6-month consulting contract." Her eyes widened slightly. 6 months? You seem disappointed." She laughed softly. "Actually, I was hoping I had not completely ruined my chances. You improved them." The smile that appeared on her face was genuine enough to catch me off guard. It was the smile of someone who had spent years hearing no before finally hearing yes. She opened the folder and reviewed the documents carefully. Most people skimmed contracts. Emily read every page. Another detail I appreciated. After several minutes, she looked up. "I would love to accept." "Good." I stood and walked toward the large digital display mounted on the wall. "Then let me show you what you are walking into." The next hour passed quickly. I introduced her to the water treatment initiative she had discussed during the interview. I expected her to ask questions about salary, title, reporting structures, or office space. Instead, nearly every question focused on the project itself. What were the environmental benchmarks? How much flexibility existed within the current budget? Which communities would be affected by the outcome? Her priorities were refreshingly different from what I had grown used to. By noon, I decided to bring her into a strategy meeting involving several senior managers. Technically, it was far earlier than most new hires would be included in discussions of that level. Something told me Emily would not waste the opportunity. The meeting began smoothly enough. Financial forecasts appeared on screens. Department heads presented updates. Then a disagreement emerged regarding implementation timelines. Within minutes, the room divided into competing viewpoints. I watched Emily quietly take notes while executive experience debated one another. Finally, one of the managers turned toward her. "You have been awfully quiet." Emily looked surprised to be addressed. "I am still learning." "Fresh eyes can be useful," he replied. "What do you think?" Several people exchanged amused glances. It was the kind of question often asked out of politeness rather than genuine interest. Emily hesitated. Then she stood and walked toward the screen. For the next 5 minutes, she calmly identified a flaw that nobody else had noticed. Not a major flaw, not a dramatic one. Just a small assumption buried inside the planning model that affected every projection built upon it. By the time she finished, the room had fallen completely silent. One executive actually recalculated the numbers on his laptop. Another stared at the screen with disbelief. The revised forecast appeared moments later. Emily was right, again. As the meeting ended, people who had barely acknowledged her presence earlier were suddenly asking questions and requesting follow-up conversations. She handled the attention gracefully, never acting as though she had accomplished anything extraordinary. From my office window later that afternoon, I watched her cross the floor speaking with employees from 3 different departments. People seemed comfortable around her almost immediately. There was no performance, no ambition disguised as charm, just authenticity, and for reasons I could not yet explain, I found myself watching a little longer than necessary. Over the next several weeks, Emily became impossible to ignore. Not because she demanded attention, quite the opposite. The people who usually attracted attention inside Sterling Renewables were loud, ambitious, and eager to take credit for every success. Emily was different. She listened more than she spoke. She asked thoughtful questions. She stayed focused on solving problems instead of building her reputation. Somehow that made people trust her faster than anyone I had seen in years. Every morning I arrived before 7. Most days, Emily was already there. Sometimes I would spot her through the glass walls of the project center, studying reports with a cup of coffee beside her laptop. Other times she would be talking with engineers, analysts, or field coordinators, gathering information most executives never bothered to learn. One evening, nearly 2 months into her contract, I walked past a conference room after a board dinner had ended. The building was mostly empty. City lights reflected off the windows overlooking Elliott Bay. I expected to find dark hallways and vacant offices. Instead, I saw Emily sitting alone at a table surrounded by maps and spreadsheets. She looked exhausted. "You are still here?" I asked from the doorway. She glanced up and smiled. "Unfortunately, it is almost 9 o'clock. I know." I stepped inside. "What are you working on?" She rotated her laptop toward me. "The Eastern Washington model." I immediately recognized the project. "That proposal was not due until next week." "I know." She laughed, softly. "But something was bothering me." And her eyes brightened the way they always did when discussing a challenge. "I think I found a way to reduce operating costs by another 11%. I stared at the screen. 11%? Maybe 12 if the pilot performs the way I think it will. Most consultants would have waited until the scheduled presentation. Most employees would have protected their work until they received recognition for it. Emily simply wanted to solve the problem. We spent nearly an hour reviewing her calculations. By the end, I realized she might be right again. As we left the building together, cool evening air drifted in from the waterfront. The streets below glowed beneath rows of city lights. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said as we waited for the elevator. "Of course. Why did you take a chance on me?" The question surprised me.
Your work earned the opportunity. That is not what I mean.
She looked down briefly before meeting my eyes. Most people would have dismissed me that first day. I remembered the rain, the mud, the assumptions I had made within seconds of seeing her. "Honestly," I asked. "Honestly, I almost did." Emily smiled. "I figured as much. But then you gave me a reason not to." The elevator doors opened. Neither of us moved immediately. "You reminded me of something important," I continued. "The best people do not always arrive in perfect packaging." For a second, her expression softened. Not proud, not amused, simply grateful. Then the moment passed. We stepped into the elevator together, and for reasons I could not fully explain, I found myself looking forward to seeing her again the next morning. By the beginning of spring, Emily's 6-month contract had become one of the most discussed topics inside Sterling Renewables. Not because she sought recognition, but because results followed her wherever she went. Departments that rarely cooperated were suddenly sharing information. Delayed initiatives were moving forward. Several of the recommendations she had made during her first weeks were already producing measurable improvements. Yet what impressed me most had nothing to do with numbers. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was walking through the operations floor when I noticed a young analyst sitting alone near the back of the office. His shoulders were tense, and a half-finished presentation remained open on his screen. Most executive would have walked past without noticing. Emily did not. She pulled up a chair beside him and spent nearly 40 minutes helping him prepare for a meeting he was clearly nervous about. She did not have to. It was not part of her responsibilities. There was no audience to witness it. Later that day, I overheard the analyst telling a coworker that Emily was the first senior employee who had ever taken the time to explain things without making him feel inadequate. That conversation stayed with me. The higher people climbed in business, the more they often forgot what it felt like to be uncertain. Emily never seemed to forget. A few weeks later, we traveled together to review one of the field sites connected to the water treatment initiative. The facility sat nearly 200 miles east of Seattle. The drive took most of the morning. Rolling hills stretched beneath a bright blue sky, and patches of wildflowers had begun appearing alongside the highway. Normally, I spent work trips, answering emails and reviewing reports. This time was different. Somewhere outside Yakima, our conversation shifted away from budgets and project timelines. We talked about families, careers, mistakes, lessons neither of us had expected to learn. I discovered that Emily had spent years working on environmental projects in small communities that larger firms ignored because the profit margins were too low. She told stories about local volunteers, farmers, and town leaders who found creative ways to solve problems despite limited resources. Those projects did not make headlines, she said as she looked out the window, but they changed lives. There was no self-congratulation in her voice, just quiet pride. You could have earned far more money somewhere else, I said. Emily smiled. Probably. Then, why stay? She thought for a moment. Because impact matters more than attention. The answer should not have surprised me. It fit everything I had learned about her. Still, hearing it affected me more than I expected. Later that afternoon, while touring the facility, something else happened that caught my attention. One of the site managers made a mistake during a presentation. It was minor, but several people immediately began criticizing him. Before the situation could become uncomfortable, Emily redirected the discussion towards solutions rather than blame. Within minutes, the tension disappeared. On the drive back to Seattle, I found myself unusually quiet. The setting sun painted the horizon with shades of gold and orange. Emily eventually noticed. "You seem thoughtful," I laughed softly. "That obvious?" "A little." For several seconds, I considered saying nothing. Then I answered honestly. "You keep surprising me." She looked genuinely confused. "How?" "Every time I think I understand what makes you exceptional, I discover another reason." Emily stared out at the passing landscape before speaking. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." The warmth in her voice lingered long after the conversation ended, and somewhere during those miles back to Seattle, without realizing it, I crossed a line I had never intended to approach. Emily was no longer simply a consultant whose talent I admired. She had become the person whose presence I looked forward to most at the beginning of every day. The first sign that something was wrong arrived on a Monday morning. I walked into headquarters expecting to review final projections for the Eastern Washington Initiative. Instead, I found 3 urgent messages waiting in my inbox and a board meeting scheduled with almost no notice. That never happened unless there was a serious problem. By 8:30, every senior executive was seated around the conference table. The atmosphere felt different immediately. Tense. Controlled. Unusually quiet. Richard Hale, one of our longest-serving division directors, stood near the screen at the front of the room. He had been with the company for nearly 15 years and was respected by most of the board. As the presentation began, he displayed a series of reports connected to the project Emily had helped redesign. My stomach tightened almost immediately. Cost overruns, delays, forecast discrepancies, missing documentation. The numbers painted an ugly picture. Richard concluded. Many of these decisions originated from recommendations introduced during the recent consulting phase. Nobody needed him to say the name. Everyone knew exactly who he meant. I glanced around the room. Several board members looked concerned. Others looked disappointed. Then Richard delivered the statement that changed everything. I believe Emily Carter's recommendations may have placed the project at significant risk. The room fell silent. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard him. Emily's recommendations had consistently improved performance. We had months of evidence supporting that fact. Yet the documents on the screen appeared convincing. Disturbingly convincing. "What is your evidence?" I asked. Richard calmly handed out additional reports. Internal reviews, financial audits, operational assessments. Board members began reading through the material. Questions followed. Concerns escalated. By the end of the meeting, a formal review had been approved. Until the investigation concluded, several project decisions would be frozen. As people left the room, I remained seated. Something felt wrong. Not emotionally wrong, logically wrong. The data supported Richard's argument, yet every instinct I possessed told me the story was incomplete. 2 hours later, Emily entered my office. Someone had clearly informed her about the meeting. She looked calm, but I noticed the tension in her eyes. "I heard there is an investigation." "There is." She nodded once. "Do you believe I did something wrong?" The question landed harder than I expected. I could have answered as a CEO, carefully, diplomatically. Instead, I answered honestly, "No." Relief flickered across her face before disappearing. "Then why does everyone suddenly look at me differently?" I wished I had an answer. "Because people are afraid," I said quietly. "When projects become uncertain, fear spreads faster than facts." Emily looked out the window toward the Seattle skyline. Gray clouds had begun gathering above the city again. "I worked harder on this project than anything I have done in years." "I know." "Then I will cooperate with whatever review they need." Her voice remained steady, but I could hear the disappointment beneath it. "I have nothing to hide." After she left, I stared at the closed door for a long time. The easiest option would have been to step back and let the process unfold. Most executives would have done exactly that. The risk was obvious. If Emily truly had made mistakes, defending her could damage my credibility with the board. Yet the more I reviewed the reports, the less sense they made. Certain assumptions contradicted previous data. Several conclusions appeared based on incomplete information. Small inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a troubling pattern. Late that evening, long after most employees had gone home, I sat alone in my office reviewing documents for the third time. Rain tapped softly against the windows, reminding me of the day Emily first walked into my life. Back then, I had judged her before knowing her. I was not going to make that mistake again. Somewhere inside hundreds of pages of reports, someone was hiding the truth. And for the first time in my career, I realized this investigation was no longer only about protecting a project. It was about protecting someone who had earned my trust. For the next 10 days, I became something I had not been in years, suspicious. As CEO, I relied on teams, reports, and systems. Trust was necessary for a company of our size to function. Yet every time I reviewed the investigation documents, the same feeling returned. Something was missing. The numbers did not tell a complete story. The deeper I looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Small discrepancies hidden inside budget transfers. Timeline adjustments that did not match project records. Performance reports that used different baseline measurements than previous reviews. Individually, each issue seemed harmless. Together, They formed a pattern that could not be ignored. One evening, long after sunset, Lauren entered my office carrying a stack of archived reports. "You should see this," she said. I took the folder from her and began comparing data from earlier project phases. Within minutes, my pulse quickened. Several cost overruns being blamed on Emily's recommendations had actually originated months before she joined the company. Somehow, those expenses had been reassigned during the review process. "Who approved these revisions?" I asked. Lauren pointed to a signature line, "Richard Hale." I leaned back in my chair. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Richard was experienced, intelligent, careful. He would not make mistakes like this accidentally. The realization settled heavily over the room. "Keep digging," I said quietly. "Everything." The following days revealed even more. Internal emails, meeting records, budget revisions. Gradually, a picture emerged. Richard had opposed the Eastern Washington redesign from the beginning. Emily's recommendations threatened several long-standing contracts connected to vendors he had worked with for years. Her success had exposed inefficiencies he preferred to leave untouched. The investigation had never been about protecting the company. It had been about protecting his influence. The final confirmation arrived 2 days before the board's scheduled review. Lauren placed a printed email chain on my desk. I read it twice to make sure I understood what I was seeing. There it was, direct evidence that critical data had been selectively excluded before being presented to the board. Not fabricated, not altered, simply hidden, enough to completely change the conclusions. I closed the folder and stared out the window. Below, Seattle glittered beneath the evening lights. Somewhere in the city, Emily was likely preparing herself for a meeting that could determine her future. She still had no idea how close she had come to losing everything she had worked for. The board meeting began at 9 the next morning. Every seat was filled. Tension hung in the room before anyone spoke. Richard sat confidently near the center of the table. Several directors appeared prepared to finalize recommendations based on the investigation. I stood and walked to the front of the room. "Before we proceed," I said, "there is additional information the board needs to review." The next 30 minutes changed everything. One by one, I presented the evidence, original financial records, historical project data, internal communications, timeline comparisons. The room grew quieter with every slide. Questions shifted direction. Assumptions collapsed. By the end, nobody was discussing Emily's supposed mistakes anymore. They were discussing how the investigation itself had been compromised. Richard's confidence disappeared slowly, then completely. When the presentation ended, silence filled the room. Finally, one board member removed his glasses and exhaled heavily. "So Emily Carter was correct all along." "Yes," I answered, "she was." Another director shook his head. "And the project improvements, real." More silence followed. Then came something I had not expected, relief. Not just my own, the board's as well. Because the truth was simpler than the accusations. The project was succeeding. The company was moving in the right direction. And the person most responsible for that success had nearly been sacrificed because others were unwilling to change. Later that afternoon, I asked Emily to meet me in my office. When she arrived, she looked understandably anxious. I stood before she even sat down. "The review is over," she searched my face, and a smile finally appeared. "You were right." For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then her shoulders relaxed as though she had been carrying an invisible weight for weeks. "It is finished?" "Yes." Emotion flickered across her face, relief, gratitude, exhaustion. I realized then that protecting her reputation had mattered to me far more than any project outcome. And for the first time, I stopped trying to pretend otherwise. 6 months later, the Eastern Washington Initiative became one of the most successful projects in company history. Operating costs dropped. Efficiency improved. Communities that had waited years for sustainable infrastructure finally saw progress. Industry publications wrote about the project. Competitors studied it. Investors praised it. Yet when people congratulated me on the achievement, I always thought about a rainy morning in Seattle and a woman standing in a lobby with mud on her boots. Success has a strange way of revealing what truly matters. For years, I had measured accomplishments through growth charts, quarterly reports, and board approvals. Then Emily Carter arrived and quietly changed that perspective. The board offered her a permanent executive position before her consulting contract officially ended. Nobody was surprised when she accepted. By then, she had earned the respect of nearly everyone in the company. What surprised me was how much the decision meant to me personally. One evening in early summer, we attended a community event celebrating the completion of the project's first phase. It was held outdoors near the waterfront. Families walked along the shoreline, children played near informational exhibits. The setting sun painted the water with shades of gold and orange. As the event ended, Emily and I remained behind while the crowd slowly dispersed. A warm breeze drifted in from the bay. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the sunset. "Do you ever think about that interview?" I finally asked. Emily laughed. "More often than I would like to admit." "I am serious. So am I." She shook her head. "It still feels unreal sometimes." I smiled. "You know, when I first saw you, I thought you had no chance." "I know." "You know?" "Victoria." Everyone knew. We both laughed. Then her expression softened. The truth is, I almost turned around that morning. I looked at her in surprise. "Really?" She nodded. When I saw how I looked, I felt ridiculous. I kept thinking nobody would take me seriously. "What changed your mind?" Emily stared out across the water. "My father used to say that character is revealed when things stop going according to plan." Remembered hearing something similar during her interview. I figured if I gave up before I even walked through the door, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Silence settled between us again. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. The kind shared between people who understand one another. "I am glad you did not leave," I said quietly. Emily turned toward me. The fading sunlight reflected in her eyes. "So am I." In that moment, I realized something I had been avoiding for months. Somewhere between project meetings, long drives, difficult challenges, and countless conversations, admiration had become something deeper, not sudden, not dramatic, just honest. The kind of feeling that grows slowly until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. Emily seemed to understand before I found the words. Her smile was warm and familiar. "You changed my life, Victoria." I shook my head gently. "No. You changed mine." We stood there watching the last traces of sunlight disappear beyond the horizon. The future remained uncertain, as all futures are. But for the first time in a very long time, uncertainty felt exciting rather than frightening. Because sometimes the people who transform our lives do not arrive when conditions are perfect. Sometimes they arrive during storms. Sometimes they arrive carrying doubts, scars, and challenges nobody else can see. And sometimes, if we are willing to look beyond first impressions, we discover that the person we nearly overlooked becomes the person we can no longer imagine living without. If this story touched your heart, comment the number 8.